I never thought a Tuesday morning would end with me holding a yellow document from 1863 that would completely destroy an HOA president's entire world. But here we are. My name is Thomas Thatcher, and I run a small veterinary practice in Larkspur, Colorado. Life had been pretty straightforward until 3 months ago when I inherited my grandfather's 800-acre ranch just outside town. Grandpa William had passed at 97, sharp as a tack until the very end, and he'd left everything to me with one handwritten note. "Don't let the vultures take what's ours." I thought he was being paranoid. Turns out, he was being prophetic. The ranch sat on prime Colorado land with mountain views that could make a grown man weep. Rolling hills, a creek that ran year-round, and enough space that you could ride a horse for an hour and still be on your own property. Grandpa had run cattle there for decades, though in recent years, he'd scaled back to just maintaining the land and leasing some pastures to neighboring ranchers. The property bordered a newer development called Sunset Ridge Estates, one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every house looked identical and the yards were measured with rulers to ensure the grass wasn't a millimeter too long. I'd been out to the ranch maybe twice since the funeral, mostly to check on the property and make sure the house wasn't falling apart. The old farmhouse needed work, but it had good bones. I was considering whether to move out there permanently or keep it as a weekend retreat when I got the first letter. It arrived on a Monday, printed on expensive cream-colored cardstock with an embossed header that read, Sunset Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The letter was signed by someone named Deborah Patterson, HOA president, and it informed me in the most condescending corporate speak imaginable that my property was in violation of community standards and needed to be brought into compliance immediately. I read it 3 times, certain I was missing something. My property wasn't part of their HOA. It had never been part of their HOA. The ranch predated their development by over a century. But there it was, a list of violations: unpermitted livestock structures, unapproved fencing, failure to maintain landscaping standards, and my personal favorite, unauthorized agricultural activities within residential zones. I called the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered on the second ring with a voice that could freeze nitrogen. Sunset Ridge HOA, this is Deborah speaking. Hi, Deborah. My name is Thomas Thatcher. I just received a letter from your office about property violations, but I think there's been some mistake. My property isn't part of your HOA. There was a pause, then a laugh that had no humor in it. Mr. Thatcher, I'm looking at the plat maps right now. Your property falls within our extended boundaries. The previous owner may not have been properly informed, but ignorance of HOA regulations doesn't constitute an exemption. Extended boundaries? My grandfather owned this land since 1952. Your development didn't exist until, 10 years ago? 15 years, actually. Her tone had shifted from cold to actively hostile. And when the county approved our development, they granted us oversight of all contiguous properties to maintain property values and community standards. You have 30 days to comply with the violations listed, or will be forced to assess fines of $500 per day. My blood pressure spiked. You can't just claim someone's property as part of your HOA without them agreeing to it. The covenants were filed with the county, Mr. Thatcher. This isn't a negotiation. We'll be sending an inspection team next week to document the current state of your property. I suggest you start addressing these issues promptly. Good day. She hung up before I could respond. I spent the rest of that day fuming and researching. I pulled up county records, historical documents, anything I could find about the ranch and the HOA. The development had indeed been approved 15 years ago, but nothing I found suggested they had any legal right to extend their authority over existing properties. The ranch had been in continuous private ownership, paying its own taxes, operating independently. There was no mechanism by which an HOA could just absorb someone's land. But Deborah Patterson seemed absolutely convinced she had the authority to do exactly that. The inspection team showed up the following Tuesday at 8 in the morning. I'd driven out to the ranch the night before, specifically to be there when they arrived. 3 people climbed out of a white SUV with the Sunset Ridge logo on the side. Deborah herself, a man in his 50s with a clipboard who introduced himself as Richard from the HOA board, and a younger woman with a camera who didn't bother introducing herself at all. Deborah was exactly what I'd pictured from her voice. Mid-50s, severely styled blonde hair, wearing what probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. She had the kind of face that suggested she asked to speak to managers professionally. Mr. Thatcher. She didn't offer a handshake. We're here to conduct the property inspection as indicated in our correspondence. And I'm here to tell you that you have no authority to inspect anything on my property. Her smile was predatory. As I explained on the phone, your property falls under HOA jurisdiction. Refusing to comply with a lawful inspection will result in immediate fines and potential legal action. Show me the documentation that says my property is part of your HOA. Richard stepped forward, flipping through papers on his clipboard. The county approved our expansion in 2019. Any properties within a half-mile radius of the development boundaries were incorporated into the HOA's purview to prevent incompatible land use. You can't just incorporate someone's private property without their consent. Actually, Deborah said, her voice dripping with false patience, we can. Colorado law allows HOAs to expand their jurisdictions with county approval when necessary to protect property values. Your ranch, Mr. Thatcher, significantly impacts the aesthetic experience and property values of our community. Those old barns, the livestock facilities, the general state of disrepair, it's unacceptable. I felt my jaw clench. Those old barns have been here since before your parents were born. This is a working ranch. Was a working ranch, she corrected. Now it's an eyesore that's costing our residents tens of thousands of dollars in lost property value. We're offering you a solution. Clean it up, modernize it, or better yet, sell it to the development company that's been trying to purchase it. They've made very generous offers, I understand. And there it was. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about forcing me to sell. I'm not selling. Then you'll be in compliance by the deadline or you'll be paying fines. Now, we're conducting our inspection with or without your cooperation. She moved to walk past me. I stepped into her path. Get off my property. Richard looked nervous, but Deborah just smiled wider. Refusing a lawful inspection, refusing to comply with HOA regulations, you're racking up quite the list of violations, Mr. Thatcher. I'll be sure to document all of this for our legal team. Document this. You're trespassing. Leave now or I'm calling the sheriff. For a long moment, we stood there in a standoff. Finally, Deborah turned on her heel. You're making a serious mistake. We'll see you in court. They left, but I knew this was far from over. The next letter arrived 4 days later, this time via certified mail. It was a formal notice of violation with a detailed list of fines, $15,000 in initial penalties, with $500 per day accruing until the property was brought into compliance. There was also a notice of liens. They were claiming the right to place a line on my property for unpaid HOA, dues, and fines. I took everything to a lawyer that afternoon. Sarah Kirkwood had handled my grandfather's estate, and she was the only real estate attorney I knew in town. Her office was in downtown Larkspur, a converted Victorian house with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with law books. This is insane, Sarah said, reading through the HOA documents. They can't just claim jurisdiction over existing private property. That's what I told them. She kept reading, her frown deepening. Okay, so here's the problem. There is a provision in Colorado law that allows HOAs to expand under certain circumstances, usually when there's a legitimate concern about property use affecting the surrounding area. But it requires proper notice, hearings, and the property owner has the right to contest it. I never received any notice. That's our argument. If they didn't properly notify your grandfather or follow due process, then their claimed jurisdiction is invalid. But proving that might be complicated. Records get lost, notices get missed, it'll be our word against theirs. So what do we do? Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking. We file a response contesting their authority. We'll argue that the expansion was improperly executed and that they have no legal standing to enforce these regulations on your property. It'll probably end up in front of a judge. How long will that take? Months, maybe longer. And in the meantime, they'll keep racking up fines and threatening legal action. It's a pressure tactic. They're hoping you'll just give up and sell. I thought about my grandfather's note. Don't let the vultures take what's ours. Start the paperwork, I said. I'm not selling. Sarah filed our response the next week, and things escalated quickly. The HOA responded with their own legal filings, claiming that I was operating an unpermitted commercial agricultural operation in a residential zone, that I was creating environmental hazards, and that I was intentionally devaluing their members' properties. It was all garbage, but it was official garbage filed with the court. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Deborah Patterson made it her personal mission to make my life hell. She filed complaints with the county about everything from alleged water rights violations to claims that I was running an illegal business on residential land. None of it stuck. The ranch had all its permits and had been legally operating for decades, but every complaint meant I had to spend time dealing with inspectors and filing responses. She also started showing up, not on my property, but on the public road that bordered it, taking pictures and videos. She'd be there when I arrived, filming me as I drove in. She'd be there when I left, documenting everything. It was harassing behavior, but technically legal since she was on a public road. The real breaking point came 3 weeks before our court date. I drove out to the ranch on a Saturday morning to find that someone had cut the fence along the property line with the development. 50 yards of fence, cleanly cut, and a dozen cattle from a neighboring ranch had wandered through onto my land. It took me 4 hours and help from 2 neighbors to round them up and fix the fence. I reported it to the sheriff's office, but without evidence of who'd done it, there wasn't much they could do. I knew it was the HOA. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. That night, I sat in my grandfather's old farmhouse, frustrated and angry, and feeling like I was fighting a losing battle. The HOA had money, organization, and what appeared to be support from at least some people in the county government. I was one person trying to hold on to family land against people who saw it as nothing more than an obstacle to their property values. I started going through my grandfather's papers, looking for anything that might help. He'd kept everything: old tax records, bills of sale for cattle from the 1960s, receipts for fence posts. The man had never thrown away a document in his life. Most of it was useless for my current situation, but it felt important somehow, connecting with his meticulous record-keeping. That's when I found the metal box. It was in the back of his filing cabinet, heavy and locked with an old combination lock. I tried his birthday, my grandmother's birthday, the year he bought the ranch. Nothing worked. I was about to give up when I noticed numbers penciled on the bottom of the drawer: 186304, April 1863. The lock clicked open. Inside was a leather folder, cracked with age but carefully preserved. I opened it with trembling hands, and there it was, a land patent dated April 15, 1863, signed by Abraham Lincoln himself. The document granted 800 acres of Colorado Territory land to my great-great-grandfather, Jonathan Thatcher, under the Homestead Act of 1862. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the seal was intact and the signatures were clear. I'd heard family stories about our ancestor homesteading in Colorado, but I'd always assumed those claims had been superseded by later purchases and sales. This changed everything. A land patent was different from a deed. It was a direct grant of land from the federal government, and under constitutional law, it carried protections that regular property deeds didn't have. I spent the rest of the night researching land patents, reading case law, and understanding what I was holding. Land patents created what was called allodial title, absolute ownership free from any feudal dues or requirements. Property with allodial title couldn't be taxed into foreclosure, couldn't be claimed through eminent domain without extraordinary justification, and definitely couldn't be absorbed into an HOA against the owner's will. This was my grandfather's insurance policy, the weapon he'd known I'd need. Monday morning, I walked into Sarah's office with the patent in a protective sleeve. "Please tell me that's what I think it is," she said when she saw it. "Land patent from 1863. Continuous chain of ownership through my family ever since." Sarah handled it like it was made of glass, reading every word. When she looked up, she was grinning. "Thomas, this is a nuclear bomb. Do you understand what this means? That the HOA has no authority over my property? Not just that. It means they never could have had authority. A land patent creates a different class of ownership than regular property deeds. The legal precedent is overwhelming. Properties held under patent title are essentially immune to the kind of jurisdictional expansion they're claiming. We need to file this with the court immediately. We did exactly that. Sarah prepared an amended response that included the land patent, case law supporting patent title protections, and a motion to dismiss the HOA's claims entirely. We filed it 2 days before the scheduled hearing. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Deborah Patterson called my cell phone at 9 o'clock that night. I didn't answer. She called 6 more times, leaving increasingly angry voicemails. The final one was almost unhinged. "You think you're clever, Mr. Thatcher? You think some old piece of paper changes anything? We have lawyers, we have resources, and we will bury you in legal fees until you're begging to sell that property for pennies on the dollar. This isn't over." I saved all the voicemails. They'd be useful later. The hearing was held in the Larkspur County Courthouse, a modern building that always seemed too new for the historic downtown. Judge Margaret Chen presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. The courtroom was packed, apparently. Word had gotten around about the case, and half the county wanted to see how it played out. The HOA had brought 3 lawyers. 3, all of them in expensive suits, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than my truck. Deborah Patterson sat in the front row, looking confident and vindictive. Sarah stood up when the judge called the case. "Your Honor, we're asking for a complete dismissal of the HOA's claims against Mr. Thatcher's property. As outlined in our most recent filing, Mr. Thatcher holds his property under a land patent issued in 1863 by the federal government. This creates a allodial title, which cannot be subjected to HOA jurisdiction without the owner's explicit consent." One of the HOA lawyers, a silver-haired man who introduced himself as Gerald Moss, stood up. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's patent claim is interesting but irrelevant. Colorado property law has evolved significantly since 1863. Modern zoning regulations, HOA covenants, and county ordinances supersede historical documents. The HOA's expansion was properly approved by the county through legitimate channels, and Mr. Thatcher's property falls within our jurisdiction regardless of how he acquired it." Judge Chen looked at the documents in front of her. "Counsel, are you arguing that a federal land patent can be overridden by county-level HOA regulations?" "We're arguing that reasonable restrictions on property use, properly enacted, serve the public good and can be applied even to properties with historical ownership claims." "That's not what I asked." The judge's tone had an edge to it. "Ms. Kirkwood, walk me through the legal basis for patent title protection." Sarah stood again. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court established in multiple cases, most notably Summa Corporation versus California State Lands Commission, that land patents create a superior form of title that can only be challenged by the federal government itself, and only under specific circumstances. State and local governments cannot impose restrictions that would effectively nullify that title. An HOA, which is a private entity, has even less standing. The HOA's attempt to claim jurisdiction over Mr. Thatcher's property is legally identical to them trying to claim jurisdiction over federal parkland or a military base. "That's a false equivalence," Moss argued. "Mr. Thatcher's property is privately owned and has been subject to county regulations for decades." "Regulations, yes," Sarah countered, "but not involuntary inclusion in a private HOA's jurisdiction. Mr. Thatcher never signed any covenants, never agreed to any HOA rules, and his property's patent status means he can't be forced to do so." Judge Chen spent a long time reading through the case law Sarah had submitted. The courtroom was silent except for the clock on the wall ticking away seconds. Finally, she looked up. "Mr. Moss, does your client have any documentation showing that Mr. Thatcher or his grandfather consented to HOA jurisdiction?" "Your Honor, when the county approved our expansion, that's not what I asked. Do you have any agreement, any signature, any documented consent?" Moss shuffled papers. "The county approval process included notice requirements. Show me proof that notice was properly served to Mr. Thatcher's grandfather in accordance with Colorado law." More paper shuffling. Moss whispered urgently with his colleagues. "Your Honor, we'd need to pull additional records from county archives." "You've had weeks to prepare for this hearing, Counselor. Either you have the documentation or you don't." The silence stretched. Finally, Moss admitted, "We don't have documented proof of notice at this time, Your Honor." Judge Chen's expression hardened. "Let me be clear about what I'm seeing here. You have an HOA that claims jurisdiction over a property held under federal land patent with no documented consent from the owner and apparently no proof that proper legal notice was ever served. Is that correct?" "Your Honor, if we could request a continuance to gather." "Denied." The judge's voice was sharp. "This court finds that the plaintiff, Sunset Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, has failed to establish any legal basis for claiming jurisdiction over the defendant's property. The property in question is held under a valid federal land patent creating allodial title, which cannot be subjected to HOA authority without the owner's explicit consent. All claims against Mr. Thatcher are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, Mr. Thatcher is entitled to recover reasonable attorney fees and costs." Deborah Patterson stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. That property is destroying our communities. Madam, sit down and be quiet, or I'll have you removed for contempt." Judge Chen's tone left no room for argument. Deborah sat, her face red with fury. The judge continued, "Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to remove any liens they've placed on Mr. Thatcher's property within 10 business days and to cease all harassment, including the accumulation of fines and penalties. Mr. Moss, your client is dangerously close to facing sanctions for pursuing a frivolous claim. I suggest you advise them carefully about their next steps." The gavel came down, and it was over. Just like that, the HOA's attempt to annex 800 acres of family land had been obliterated by a piece of paper from 1863. Sarah was grinning as we walked out of the courthouse. "That was beautiful. Did you see Moss's face when the judge started asking for documentation?" I saw Deborah's face. That's the look of someone who's not done yet. Sarah's grin faded. "You think they'll try something else?" "I know they will. This was never about property values or community standards. Someone wants that land, and they're not going to stop just because a judge told them no." I was right. The HOA couldn't pursue legal action anymore, but that didn't stop Deborah Patterson from trying other methods. The harassment intensified. Someone filed an anonymous tip with the Colorado Department of Agriculture claiming I was operating an illegal slaughterhouse on the property. I'd barely used the property except for maintaining it, but I had to spend a day dealing with inspectors who found exactly nothing. Then there was a complaint to the EPA about alleged water contamination. Again, nothing. The creek running through my property was cleaner than most drinking water. Then someone started leaving things on my property. Not on the house or anywhere obvious, but scattered around the land. Trash, old tires, broken furniture. It was obviously placed there deliberately, probably to create evidence for more complaints about me not maintaining the property. I spent weekends cleaning up other people's garbage. The final straw came on a Wednesday evening. I got a call from Hank Morrison, one of the neighboring ranchers who'd helped me round up those cattle weeks earlier. "Thomas, you need to get out to your place right now." "What's wrong?" "Someone started a controlled burn on the southeast corner of your property. Fire department's already on the way, but it's spreading fast." I broke every speed limit getting there. By the time I arrived, 3 fire trucks were working to contain a grass fire that had consumed about 20 acres. The firefighters had it under control, but it had been close another 10 minutes and it would have reached the old barn where my grandfather had stored decades of equipment and family belongings. The fire chief, a grizzled man named Tom Rodriguez, met me as I jumped out of my truck. "You're lucky someone spotted the smoke early. Another few minutes and you'd have lost a lot more than grass." "How did it start?" "Still investigating, but it looks intentional. We found evidence of accelerant use. I've already called the sheriff." Sheriff Mike Brennan arrived 20 minutes later. He was in his late 50s, been sheriff for as long as I could remember, and he didn't look happy. We walked the perimeter of the burn area, and he examined the spot where investigators thought the fire had started. "Thomas, you got any idea who might want to do this?" I told him everything. The HOA's attempts to claim my property, the court case, the escalating harassment. I played him the voicemails from Deborah Patterson, showed him the documentation of every complaint and incident. Brennan's jaw tightened as he listened. "You should have come to me about this harassment weeks ago." I thought I could handle it legally, and I did. We won in court. Winning in court doesn't mean much if someone's willing to commit arson. He pulled out his radio. I'm going to have deputies start investigating this seriously. If the HOA or anyone associated with them is behind this, we'll find out. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Turns out, when you're looking for someone who started a fire, you check cameras and witnesses in the area. A home security camera from one of the houses in Sunset Ridge Estates had captured a white SUV with the HOA logo driving past right around the time the fire started, heading in the direction of my property. The same SUV came back 20 minutes later, driving fast. The SUV was registered to the HOA. Deborah Patterson had checked it out that afternoon. Sheriff Brennan brought her in for questioning 2 days after the fire. I wasn't there for it, but he told me about it afterward. She denied everything at first, Brennan said. We were sitting in his office, a cramped space with filing cabinets and wanted posters on the walls. Said she was just driving around, checking on properties in the area. But when we pressed her about the timing and mentioned we were checking her vehicle for trace evidence of accelerants, she lawyered up immediately. Can you prove she started the fire? We're working on it. We've got her vehicle on camera in the area at the right time. We've got her documented history of harassment toward you, and we've got forensic teams going over that SUV with a fine-tooth comb. If she was involved, we'll prove it. And if she wasn't, if she sent someone else to do it, then we find that someone else and flip them. Arson's a serious crime, Thomas. People don't generally take that kind of fall for an HOA president. It took another week, but the case broke open in the most unexpected way. Richard, the HOA board member who'd been with Deborah during that first inspection attempt, came forward voluntarily. He walked into the sheriff's office with his own lawyer and gave a full statement. Deborah Patterson had been under pressure from a development company called Horizon Ridge Properties. They'd been trying to buy my grandfather's land for years to expand Sunset Ridge Estates, and when he'd refused to sell, they'd made a deal with the HOA, get the land one way or another, and they'd fund a complete renovation of the development's common areas, new clubhouse, new pool, new everything. It was a multi-million-dollar bribe, essentially. Deborah had become obsessed with making it happen. The attempt to claim HOA jurisdiction had been her first plan. When that failed, she'd escalated. The fence cutting had been her idea, carried out by her son-in-law. The garbage dumping had been her. And yes, she'd started the fire, thinking that if the property looked damaged and dangerous enough, she could pressure me to sell or at least get the county to condemn parts of it. Richard had gone along with it at first, thinking it was just aggressive HOA tactics. But arson was too far. He wasn't going to risk prison time for someone else's obsession. The arrests happened on a Monday morning. Deborah Patterson was charged with arson, criminal mischief, harassment, and about 6 other counts. Her son-in-law got charged with criminal mischief and trespassing for the fence cutting. The HOA board was dissolved pending a complete investigation by the Colorado HOA Oversight Board. The story made local news, then state news, then somehow went viral online. Apparently, people loved the narrative of an evil HOA president trying to steal family land and getting taken down by a document from 1863. I got interview requests from news outlets across the country. I declined most of them. I'm not comfortable with that kind of attention, but I did do one interview with a local paper to set the record straight. The fallout was significant. Horizon Ridge Properties denied any knowledge of Deborah's actions, but their reputation took a massive hit anyway. Several families in Sunset Ridge Estates filed lawsuits against the HOA for the way it had been managed. The whole development descended into chaos for months. Meanwhile, I finally got to focus on what mattered, the ranch itself. I'd spent so much time fighting off the HOA that I hadn't really thought about what I wanted to do with the property long term. Now I had the space to figure it out. I decided to keep running my veterinary practice in town, but to move out to the ranch full time. The old farmhouse needed work, but it was solid, and there was something peaceful about being out there, surrounded by land that had been in my family for over 160 years. I wasn't going to run cattle that wasn't my passion, but I could maintain the land, maybe lease some of it to neighbors for grazing, keep it as open space in a county that was increasingly being carved up into developments. I also had the land patent officially recorded with the county in every possible registry. Sarah helped me make sure it was bulletproof, documented in ways that would prevent anyone from ever trying something like this again. The patent was our family's legacy, and I wasn't going to let it get buried in a filing cabinet again. Deborah Patterson's trial happened 8 months after her arrest. She pleaded guilty to most of the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She got 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from coming within 1,000 feet of my property. Her son-in-law got probation and community service. I attended the sentencing hearing. I wanted to look her in the eye one last time. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood up. Your Honor, Deborah Patterson tried to take something that wasn't hers because she couldn't imagine that other people's property rights mattered more than her goals. She harassed me, she destroyed my property, and she committed arson, all because she wanted to make a deal with a developer. But what she didn't understand is that some things aren't for sale. My family homesteaded this land in 1863, survived drought and depression and every challenge Colorado could throw at them. They built something that mattered, something worth preserving, and no HOA president, no developer, no amount of money was going to take that away. I hope her time in jail gives her a chance to understand that not everything in this world is about property values and community standards. Some things are about family, history, and respecting what came before you. Deborah didn't look at me during the statement. She stared straight ahead, her face blank. I didn't care. I'd said what I needed to say. After the trial, life slowly returned to normal. I settled into a routine at the ranch, making repairs to the old house, cleaning up the outbuildings, and getting to know the land the way my grandfather had known it. I found his journals in the attic one weekend, decades of entries about weather patterns, cattle breeding, fence repairs, and observations about the land. He'd loved this place with a quiet dedication that humbled me. One entry from 1985 stuck with me. Turned down another offer from developers today. They don't understand that this land isn't an investment or a commodity. It's family. It's history. It's the place where my father taught me to ride, where I proposed to Martha, where we raised our son. You can't put a price on that, no matter how many zeros they add to the check. He'd been fighting off developers for decades. The HOA's attempt was just the latest iteration of a battle he'd been waging most of his adult life. That land patent he'd preserved so carefully hadn't been paranoia, it had been wisdom born from experience. I started making improvements to the property, but carefully in ways that honored its history. I repaired the old barn using the same techniques my great-grandfather had used. I fixed the fencing with traditional materials. I even restored an old bunkhouse that had been falling apart, turning it into a guest house for when friends visited. The development next door went through massive changes. With Deborah gone and the HOA board dissolved, residents voted to completely restructure their governance. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Martha Simmons, came by the ranch one afternoon about a year after everything had settled. "Mr. Thatcher, I wanted to apologize on behalf of our community," she said. "We were standing on my front porch, looking out over the valley. What Deborah did was unconscionable, and I'm horrified that it happened in our name." "You weren't part of it," I said. "You don't need to apologize for her actions." "Maybe not, but I want you to know that we're working hard to be better neighbors. We've rewritten our bylaws to focus on our own community, not on trying to control everything around us. And several of our residents have told me they actually love looking out at your ranch. It reminds them why they moved to Colorado in the first place, for the open space and the history." We became friendly after that conversation. Not friends exactly, but good neighbors. When their development had issues with deer getting into yards, I gave them advice on humane deterrence. When I needed help organizing a volunteer day to clear some trails on my property, a dozen families from Sunset Ridge showed up to help. It turned out that most of the people living there were decent folks who'd had no idea what Deborah was doing. They'd been as appalled as anyone when the full story came out. 2 years after the fire, I was working in the barn when I heard a vehicle coming up the drive. I walked out to find an old pickup truck pulling up to the house, and an elderly man climbed out slowly. "Help you?" I called out. "You Thomas Thatcher?" he asked. "I am." Name's Daniel Warner. My grandfather homesteaded the property about 3 miles north of here, same time as your great-great-grandfather. I heard what happened with the HOA, saw the news stories. I wanted to come by and tell you that my family's dealing with something similar. Developer trying to claim our land through some legal loophole. I invited him in for coffee, and we talked for 2 hours. Turns out his family had also been granted their land through a patent, though his was from 1867. He'd never thought to use it as a defense against the developer's claims because he didn't realize the legal protections it offered. I gave him Sarah Kirkwood's number and showed him all the case law she'd compiled. Your family's land is just as protected as mine, I told him. Don't let them bully you into selling. Daniel left with tears in his eyes, thanking me repeatedly. A month later, he called to tell me the developer had backed off completely once they realized the property had patent title. His land was safe. That conversation got me thinking. How many other families in Colorado were sitting on old homestead patents without realizing the protection they offered? How many were getting pressured by HOAs and developers because they didn't know their rights? I started researching, reaching out to county historical societies and land offices. With Sarah's help, I identified 17 other properties in our county alone that were held under original land patents. I sent letters to all of them, explaining the legal protections they had and offering to share the resources that had helped me. It became a sort of passion project. I wasn't trying to stop all development or vilify all HOAs. Most were run by reasonable people trying to maintain their communities. But I wanted to make sure that families with historical land holdings knew they had options, that they couldn't be forced out by legal intimidation tactics. The local historical society asked me to give a talk about the ranch's history and the land patent. I agreed, even though public speaking wasn't my strong suit. About 80 people showed up, filling the small community center. I brought the patent in its protective case and told the story of my great-great-grandfather Jonathan Thatcher arriving in Colorado Territory in 1863, claiming his 800 acres under the Homestead Act and building the foundation of what would become our family's legacy. The Homestead Act was designed to encourage Western settlement by giving ordinary people access to land, I explained, but it wasn't free. You had to live on the land, improve it, farm it. You had to prove you were serious about building a life there. My great-great-grandfather did exactly that. He survived harsh winters, drought, isolation, all the challenges of frontier life. And in return, the federal government granted him permanent, absolute ownership of that land. I went on to explain how that type of ownership was different from modern property deeds, how it carried constitutional protections that couldn't be overridden by local regulations or private agreements. People were fascinated. Several came up afterward with questions about their own family properties. One woman, probably in her 70s, told me her grandfather had homesteaded in the 1870s, and she still had some of his papers, but had never looked at them carefully. You should, I told her. You might be surprised what you find. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. I split my time between my vet practice and maintaining the property. I started dating Diana Peters, a teacher at the local high school who loved hiking and didn't mind that I lived 45 minutes out of town surrounded by nothing but open space. She appreciated the history of the place, asked thoughtful questions about my grandfather's journals, and helped me plant a garden using heirloom seeds I'd found in his old workshop. You know what I love about this place? She said one evening. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. It feels real. Everything in town is so new, so manufactured. But here, you can feel the history. You can imagine what it was like when your great-great-grandfather stood on this same spot and looked out at the same view. Probably with fewer housing developments in the distance, I said. She laughed. True, but still, it's special. 3 years after the fire, I got a letter from the Colorado Historical Society. They wanted to designate the ranch as a historical property, recognizing its continuous family ownership since 1863 and its significance in Colorado's homesteading history. It came with a small plaque and some minor restrictions on what I could do with the structures, but nothing that conflicted with my plans. I accepted. The designation ceremony was held on a Saturday in June. The weather was perfect, and about 200 people showed up, neighbors, friends, members of the Historical Society, even some reporters covering the story. The mayor of Larkspur gave a speech about preserving Colorado's heritage. Sarah was there, grinning and taking pictures. Diana stood beside me, holding my hand. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. My grandfather left me this land with one instruction: don't let the vultures take what's ours. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but now I do. This ranch represents something bigger than just property. It's a connection to our past, to the people who built this state with nothing but determination and hard work. It's a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. I'm honored to preserve this piece of history, and I promise it'll stay in our family for generations to come. The applause was genuine and warm. After the ceremony, people came up to congratulate me, to share their own family stories, to take pictures with the land patent that I'd brought in its protective case. The old document had become something of a local legend. As the sun set and people began to leave, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd confronted Deborah Patterson that first morning. So much had changed since then. The harassment, the legal battles, the fire they'd all pushed me to fight for something I hadn't even been sure I wanted to keep. But in fighting for it, I'd discovered why it mattered. This land wasn't just dirt and grass and old buildings. It was legacy. It was the cumulative effort of 5 generations of my family, each one adding their own chapter to the story. My great-great-grandfather had claimed it from the wilderness. His son had survived the hard years of early statehood. My great-grandfather had weathered the Depression. My grandfather had fought off developers for decades. And now it was my turn to be a steward of that history. I thought about what might have happened if I'd given in to the HOA's demands, if I'd been intimidated by their lawyers and their threats and their escalating harassment. The ranch would have been sold to Horizon Ridge Properties, carved up into half-acre lots, transformed into another cookie-cutter development indistinguishable from 1,000 others. The farmhouse would have been demolished. The old barn would have become someone's idea of rustic decoration. The land patent would have been forgotten, probably ending up in some dusty archive if anyone bothered to preserve it at all. Instead, it was still here, still whole, still wild and beautiful and real. Diana came over and slipped her arm through mine. "What are you thinking about?" "About how close I came to losing all of this. If my grandfather hadn't saved that land patent, if I hadn't found it when I did." "But you did find it, and you fought for it. That's what matters." She was right. The document had been important, crucial even, but it had only been a tool. The real reason the ranch was still standing was because I'd decided it was worth fighting for, even when the fight got ugly and expensive and exhausting. Over the next few years, I made more improvements to the property while maintaining its character. I installed solar panels to make the house more sustainable. I worked with the local conservation district to create protected wildlife corridors. I opened the ranch to school groups for educational tours about homesteading history and land conservation. Kids would walk through the old barn, eyes wide as they tried to imagine what life was like in the 1800s. I also got involved in county land use planning. When developers proposed new projects, I'd attend the hearings and ask questions about how they planned to respect existing properties, about what protections were in place for historical sites, about whether proper notice was being given to affected landowners. I wasn't anti-development, but I wanted to make sure it happened responsibly. My perspective carried weight now. The guy who'd stood up to an abusive HOA and one using a land patent from the Civil War era, people listened when I spoke. I tried to use that platform wisely, advocating for balanced growth that preserved what made Colorado special while allowing communities to evolve. The old Sunset Ridge estates development actually became a model for how HOAs could function properly. Under new leadership, they focused on maintaining their own community without trying to control everything around them. They created good relationships with neighboring properties, including mine. When they had their annual summer barbecue, they invited me. When I needed help fixing storm damage one year, a dozen residents volunteered their time. It turned out that most people were reasonable when they weren't being manipulated by someone with ulterior motives. 5 years after the trial, I married Diana on the ranch. We held the ceremony in the same spot where my grandparents had gotten married in 1950, under the old cottonwood tree that had been there since before the homestead. Sarah was there, along with Hank Morrison and most of my neighbors. Even Sheriff Brennan came, now retired, but still gruff and protective. During the ceremony, the officiant mentioned the land's history, how it had been in my family for over 160 years and would hopefully be there for 160 more. Diana and I had talked about it, about raising kids here, about teaching them the same values my grandfather had tried to instill in me, about the importance of knowing where you come from and fighting to preserve what matters. Our first son was born 2 years later. We named him William, after my grandfather. When I held him for the first time, I thought about that metal box in the filing cabinet, about the land patent my grandfather had preserved so carefully. He'd known somehow that his descendants would need it. He'd protected it for decades, waiting for the moment when it would make the difference between keeping our family land and losing it forever. Now I had a son of my own, and someday I'd show him that patent. I'd tell him about his great-great-great-great-grandfather Jonathan, who'd claimed this land when Colorado was still a territory, about all the generations who'd fought to keep it, about the HOA president who'd tried to take it, and the 150-year-old document that had stopped her. And I'd tell him what my grandfather told me, in his own way. Some things are worth fighting for. Family, history, legacy. These things matter more than money or convenience or what some HOA president thinks your property should look like. The ranch wasn't just land anymore. It was a story, one that had been written across generations and would continue being written by my son and, hopefully, his children after him. Every fence post, every stone in the old barn, every tree that had grown there over the decades, they were all chapters in that story. Deborah Patterson got out of jail after serving most of her sentence. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Arizona, started over somewhere far from the mess she'd created in Colorado. I didn't wish her ill. Her actions had been wrong, criminal even, but I also understood that she'd been caught up in something bigger, the constant pressure of development, the temptation of money, the desire to make deals happen no matter the cost. In some ways, she was just another chapter in the same story my grandfather had lived through. The details changed, developers got more sophisticated, HOAs replaced more direct acquisition attempts, but the fundamental conflict remained the same. People who saw land as a commodity versus people who saw it as something more precious and less fungible. I chose to see it as something worth preserving. On William's first birthday, we had a small party at the ranch. Family and friends gathered in the yard, kids running around while adults talked and ate cake. At one point, I walked into the house and pulled out my grandfather's journal from the shelf where I'd kept it. I opened it to that entry from 1985 about turning down developers and read it again, smiling. He'd been right. You couldn't put a price on this place. Not because it wasn't valuable, the land was worth millions, but because its value transcended money. It was measured in sunsets watched from the porch, in cattle drives across the meadows, in children learning to ride horses, in generations of family gathered around the dinner table sharing stories. That night, after everyone had left and Diana was putting William to bed, I sat at my grandfather's old desk and started my own journal. If he'd kept records for future generations, I could do the same. May 15th, I wrote, William's first birthday. Perfect weather, good friends, family together. This ranch has been in the Thatcher family for 163 years now. Had some trouble with an HOA a few years back that tried to take it, but we fought them off using the original land patent from 1863. Sometimes I think about what Grandpa would say if he could see how it all turned out. I think he'd be proud. I hope William grows up understanding what this place means, why it's worth protecting. The land patent is in the safe, along with all the court documents from the HOA case. Someday he'll need to know that story, need to understand that keeping this place has never been easy, but has always been worth it. I closed the journal and looked out the window at the darkening valley. Lights were starting to come on in Sunset Ridge Estates, tiny pinpricks against the gathering darkness. Beyond them, the mountains stood silent and eternal. This land had been here long before the Thatchers arrived, and it would be here long after we were gone. Our role was just to be caretakers for our brief time, to preserve it and protect it and pass it on to the next generation in better shape than we'd received it. That's what my great-great-grandfather had done when he filed that homestead claim in 1863. That's what every generation since had done in their own way. And now it was my turn, with Diana and William beside me, to be part of that ongoing story. The HOA's attempt to annex the ranch had failed spectacularly, stopped by a document older than anyone alive. But more than that, it had failed because when it came down to it, I'd decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost or the effort required. That decision, more than any legal document, was what had saved the ranch. And it was that same decision that would keep it in the family for generations to come.